All right, welcome to our explainer. Today we are diving into something huge, a force that literally redrew the world map and whose effects are, well, they're still all around us. We're talking about colonialism, and it all kicks off with a really simple question. Seriously, have you ever looked at a map and just wondered why some borders are perfect, ruler straight lines? They just cut right across mountains, rivers, everything. It looks so unnatural, right? Well, that's because they are unnatural. The reason isn't found in the landscape. It was decided in some conference room thousands of miles away. Those straight lines, they're basically historical scars, and they point us directly to the topic of colonialism. So what is colonialism when you boil it all down? At its very core, it's a system of control. It's when one powerful country takes over another land and its people. And let's be clear, it's not for fun, it's to gain advantages, economic, political, you name it. This whole setup creates a relationship built on a massive and often pretty brutal power imbalance. Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this, we first need to get how this system of control actually worked on the ground. Let's take a quick look at the timeline, just to see when and how it all unfolded. This wasn't some quick event. We're talking about an entire era that spanned centuries. It really kicked off back in the 1400s with European powers looking for new trade routes and wealth. Then things just accelerated. By the 19th century, it hit its peak. Huge chunks of the globe were ruled by just a handful of empires. It wasn't until the 20th century that the tables started to turn, and we see decolonization movements fighting for and winning their independence. Now here's the thing. This massive global expansion wasn't just a chaotic land grab. It followed a surprisingly consistent set of strategies. It's almost like there was a colonial playbook for how to establish and maintain control. So let's break down the 3 key moves in that playbook. First up, political control. The goal here is pretty simple. You take charge of the government. This usually happened in one of 2 ways. You either put your own people in power, or you find local leaders and, well, persuade them to work for you. A classic case, the British Raj in India. For almost 200 years, the biggest decisions impacting millions of people weren't made in Delhi. Nope, they were made thousands of miles away in London. All right, next up is the economic engine that drove this whole machine: exploitation. You have to understand, colonies were basically treated like giant open-air warehouses. You had raw materials, cotton from India, rubber from the Congo, sugar from the Caribbean, all being extracted and shipped back to Europe to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And then, the kicker? The finished goods were often sold right back to the colonies. It was a one-way street, designed to make sure all the wealth flowed in just one direction. And finally, the third part of the playbook, cultural domination. You could almost think of this as the software of control. This is where the colonizers' language, their religion, their customs, they're all pushed as being superior. And this wasn't just about changing how people dressed or what they ate. It was about fundamentally reshaping their identity, which often led to the erosion or even erasure of indigenous cultures. And that's an impact that echoes for generations. So that's the playbook. But a system this massive and complex, you really can't understand it from just one angle. To get a much deeper, richer picture, it helps to look at it through the eyes of some of the key thinkers who studied it. Let's explore 5 different ways of seeing this. First, we've got Karl Marx. He looked at colonialism and saw one thing above all else: economics. For him, this was just capitalism doing what capitalism does, constantly expanding to find new resources, cheaper labor, and new markets to sell things to. It was all about the profit motive. Then there's Edward Said, who argued that the conquest wasn't just physical, it was mental. He saw colonialism as a battle of ideas. He really zeroed in on that cultural domination piece, showing how Western culture was set up as the universal standard. And that profoundly shaped how colonized peoples saw the world and even how they saw themselves. Frantz Fanon, who was actually a psychiatrist, really focused on the human cost. He defined colonialism as an inherently violent system. And he wasn't just talking about physical violence. He meant psychological violence too, the kind that inflicts deep trauma and dehumanizes the people living under colonial rule. The historian Jürgen Osterhammel gives us a really clear structural definition. He just boils it down to the essential power dynamic. He says it's a relationship where a small, foreign minority makes all the important decisions for an indigenous majority. And of course, those decisions always serve the interests of that foreign power. And finally, Vladimir Lenin. He put colonialism into the bigger picture of imperialism.
He saw it as the ultimate stage of capitalism, where powerful nations are in a mad scramble to carve up the world between them to expand their economic and political power.
So, okay, we've seen it through an economic lens, a psychological lens. There are a lot of ways to analyze this system. But that brings us to maybe the most difficult part of this whole conversation. What were the effects? Let's dive into the incredibly complex and deeply contested legacy of colonialism, a debate that is absolutely alive and well today. And this is where things get really, really messy. You'll hear arguments on both sides. People defending colonialism often point to things like the infrastructure that was built, railways, ports, or the introduction of modern legal systems. But you always have to ask the critical question, why were those things built? Often it was to get resources out more efficiently or to control the population more easily. And then you look at the other side of the ledger. The documented negative impacts are just staggering. We're talking about economic systems designed for dependency, the loss of cultural heritage, and yep, those artificial borders we started with, which have been a source of conflict and instability ever since. And this legacy isn't just in a few isolated places. The colonial project was truly global. I mean, it was massive in scale, and its impact basically laid the foundations for the world that we all live in today. Just look at this table for a second. It gives you a sense of that incredible scale. You have the British Empire, where they used to say the sun never set. Then there's the huge territories controlled by France, Spain, and Portugal, and that's not even all of them. This wasn't some minor footnote in history. For centuries, this was the main way global power was organized. It completely reshaped continents and tied the fates of nearly every nation on Earth together. And that brings us right back to where we started, seeing the echoes of the past in our world today. Colonialism wasn't just a chapter in a history book that we can close and put away. It's the very architecture of so much of our modern world, from global inequality and economic ties to the very lines on our maps. Understanding this history is absolutely crucial if we want to understand the world we're living in right now, which really just leaves us with one final thought. Once you start looking for these echoes, where don't you see them?